Okay, so I'm so excited. This has been a 3-year journey for us, brought to us by Caroline Alexander Ferguson, known to all of us as Kina. First off, I want to say we're really missing Maurice McDermott, who sadly is down with a bout of COVID, so she's missing out this evening. But she would be thanking you here today. And I especially want to thank the Kleberg Foundation, the Robert J. and Ellen C. Kleberg Foundation for the inspiration and the funds to do this project in a proper way. The O'Connor and Hewitt Foundation as well. And Ellen is here with us this evening, so thank you. The McCan and Cannon families as well. And the Summerlee Foundation of Dallas also helped to fund this project. So Kina brought us this project several years ago when we were doing a show called 250 Years of Texas Art. And I was new to that project, and the book was already in production. I wasn't a curator on that. That was Ron Tyler. And so things were in motion, but she said, you've got to do an exhibit on this great Texas artist that few people have heard of. So we looked at the possibility of getting into the book. We tried, several ways to have a McCan painting in that exhibit, but it was already, the train had left the station. So privileged tonight to have Kina here with us. It's been a hard couple of weeks, but we're all here, and very excited for her. She's going to tell a little bit about, let me tell you a little bit more about Kina, who's part of the Kleberg Foundation. She's one of the trustees. Kina received her BA at the University of Texas in Plan 2, her master's degree in business at Columbia University. She's been active in conservation, preservation, and land stewardship for many years in Texas, especially with her work at the King Ranch and the area of South Texas. She's also a film producer, most notably through her Rara Avis production company about the life and works of John James Audubon. She continues to support peregrine falcon research and has served with the Nature Conservancy of Texas. So she's here to say a few words about what the art of James Ferdinand McCan means to her.
Thank you, Mary Margaret. As Mary Margaret said, we started on this project 3 years ago, and we weren't exactly sure where it would lead, but I was adamant that we had to do something for James Ferdinand McCan, because I said, my goodness, he was one of the few classically trained artists who was roaming around the hinterlands of Texas in the 19th century and turned into the 20th century. And we were so lucky to have him as an artist documenting our landscape, because he was a very fine artist. So when we started on the project, Mary Margaret, as a historian, knew how to properly dig. So we started with the McCan family in Victoria, and made several trips back there. Mary Margaret did, and unearthed a lot about James McCan that we didn't know about. And if you've grown up with these McCan paintings, they just, permeate your being. You just think of them when you think of the landscape of the South Texas, Kings Hill, and Victoria areas. And I'm so grateful that we had such a fine artist recording not only the land, but the people and their animals. So I'm especially proud that we have the giant dog that came from the Wamex. He's one of my favorites. And I'm also very proud to see Prince, the bull. He changed South Texas forever, bringing the Brahman bulls into this environment. So I hope you enjoy the show, and the catalog is excellent. Mary Margaret collaborated with all of the lenders and learned an awful lot about this artist and put a lot of time and effort into it. So thank you all.
What Kina didn't say is what she told me was that she learned more about the King Ranch from those paintings before she could read or write than in any other way. So she could just look around the house and see. All right. Okay, Inspire. I hope this works. Let's see. How do you advance this thing? Here's our artist, James Ferdinand McCan, as seen in photographs from at Mary Carol McCan's house. This all started, as Kina said, with her idea. And the first trip we made was to McFadden to Sue McCann Cannon's house. And she was so gracious. She made us lunch, and we sat down, we walked in, and she was talking a bit about these paintings. And one of the first things I noticed was that the progression of these paintings was starting to tell a story of the change of landscape in Texas. And what I mean by that is the way that in 1895, which was sort of a pivotal time in cattle ranching, you could see the breeds, ranchers starting to experiment with different breeds and make a beefier, heavier animal that could sustain the heat of South Texas. And so we started talking about those sorts of developments. And it's an interesting sidebar is that, and this is one of those degrees of separation stories, is that when I told my brother I was just about to start on this project, he said, really? He said, I just bought 45 heifers from the McCan family. And we had apparently been dealing in cattle together since, well, my grandfather was named Argyle McAllen, and he dealt with Mr. Carey McCan buying and selling cattle. So our families went way back. I wasn't privy to all of that, but it's been such a great learning curve to understand the network of all of you people who know each other and have all been my friends for so long, and I never knew all of this interconnectivity, which is really lovely, and that's one of the great aspects of our state, especially South Texas. So we walked to Sue's living room, and right over the fireplace was this guy. And his name, had a name. His name was Prince. And he was exhibited at the World's Fair of 1897 as a novelty. He had been in a circus, and he was bought by the McFadden family as one of the first Brahmin bulls brought into the region to crossbreed the native lanky, stringy longhorns. And so the next painting we see is the longhorn with the heifer. So you can see there's already some thoughts of interbreeding, and no doubt Mr. McCan was looking at this. And I think he looked at things as an outsider, a stranger in a strange land, because he had come from Ireland about 7 years earlier, and he worked in Omaha, Nebraska, in a bank, and I don't think he took well to it. He had come over with his brother Henry on the endorsement of their parish priest, and I don't think they found a lot of love for Omaha, so he goes back to Ireland, goes to school to learn how to formally paint, and comes back and heads straight to Texas, straight to San Antonio, which had become a sort of I don't want to call it a colony, but it was sort of a hot spot for these painters like Herman Lundquist and Jose Arpa and Theodore Gentil and the Onderdonk father and son team. And so he comes straight to San Antonio and establishes a studio. And a lot of these painters were painting it somewhat independently, but they were also networking. And a lot of them got to show at a department store here called Marks and Sons. So this is the next thing we noticed in Sue McCan's house, which was just a treasure trove, was this. And we thought, oh, that doesn't look like a coyote. And so we started saying, what is this? Well, this story didn't come to us until after Mrs. Cannon passed. When she did pass, Maggie and Claudia, her daughters, started digging in the house and arranged to send their paintings to us for storage. They were going to redo the house. And as they were cleaning out the house, they found this box. And the box was full of letters and Mr. McCan's passport, his immigration papers, all sorts of letters, especially from his daughter-in-law, Sue Ragsdale McCan, would write to him. And she wrote in 1915 or 16, she said, "Dear Father, we got up at 4 a.m. to go on a wolf hunt, but we hunted all day and didn't find a thing." So suddenly you're seeing that McCan is painting animals and all sorts of in a transitional time. So the wolf wasn't available anymore for shooting. My father has only seen one in South Texas, and he called it a red wolf, and it was the crossbreeding of a coyote and a wolf. So here's the wolf going away. The other, which has a connection sort of to the Witte. This story has many connections to the Witte, but this in particular, Atwater prairie chicken, named for Henry Atwater, they no longer exist in the Victoria region in South Texas at all. And interestingly, the first exhibit that the Witte ever purchased was the Atwater collection, which is a whole bunch of pecans, lots of taxidermic birds. So anyway, the Atwater prairie chicken goes away, but McCan has documented it. So that's a really lovely thing that he was able to document these animals that were fast disappearing from overhunting or lack of territory, what have you. He also saw things, I think, in a way as though he was just discovering this place. I mean, in Ireland, he painted houses and cottages and the ocean, but here he's coming just to South Texas farms and ranches and painting still lifes of things that maybe you and I would just take for granted. Oh, that's just, a corn crib. But interestingly, he was soon discovered by Henrietta Chamberlain King, who had paid a visit to San Antonio, one of many, I'm sure. And she hires him to paint in 1995 her family and come and document what we see now is a changing landscape. So interestingly, he writes to his wife, Emmy McFadden McCan, who he had married in about that same year, 1895. And he was in Corpus, and he's writing to Emily saying, "I've started the painting of Mrs. King, and my God, it looks awful." And he said, "I could do such a better job with this." But he was young, and they were trying to start a family. He was very busy. He was acclimating to Texas, and he was painting this from a photograph. And as my friends who are painters, Vicki Fields, who's here, told me that painting from a photograph is much more difficult than painting from life because you don't get the subtleties of portraiture. But here she is with us, and so she was having him paint family members who had passed on, and this is the original Mr. Clayburgh, whom they called the immigrant, or at least King Ranch Inc. does. And so he's painting these from photographs for her to memorialize. And these were for her house. She had a home in Corpus where all the kiddos would go to school. They'd ride the train, is that right, Kina? Or they would somehow get coaches. They would come by coach to go to school. So, and she had her husband painted as well. And this is from a pretty well-known photograph that most historians are familiar with. So she's doing this to transport a little bit of the ranch to her Corpus house, which interestingly, was a mystery to me was the main big house at Santa Gertrudis burned in 1917, is that correct? 1915? And I didn't understand how these paintings survived if the house had burned. Well, what turns out is that these were all in Corpus. And after that house was torn down, a lot of them came back to the big house. Here's another aspect of McCan that's unusual, is that paintings during the Victorian era were often very stiff, formal, and lacked any sort of emotion. And so here's Mr. Kleberg with his arm around his mother, Rosa von Roeder, she was a German immigrant. He's still very much dressed like the Belgian family that they were, and she wore a veil every day of her life. And so you can see how things were back in 1895, and wanting to sort of, Mrs. King wanted to preserve this sort of, what would you say, legacy. But then you see this transition to the next generation, Mr. Bob, on Martin's Best was the name of this horse. And here he is looking like Cary Grant on a horse. And, you know, the classic Southwestern style was starting, and it was a more practical style of ranching. You've got, you know, your tapaderos on your boots, and you've got, you know, the proper accoutrement for working cattle. So you see more of what we know today as a working cattle ranch coming into being, all through McCan. This was an interesting painting. One of the first he also painted of the Santa Gertrudis headquarters, and we know he painted in partnership with a lot of famous Texas painters who would go on to become a big name. And this was also painted at the same exact time as a man named Tom Brown. And Tom Brown painted here in San Antonio, and he was sort of a mentor to McCan. They both have the same painting, same dimensions, same view. McCan's has less cattle, Brown's has more cattle. And and here it is. You can see that they are painting side by side, if you will. And the mesquite has the beans turning yellow, which is a springtime thing, because they go from purple to, you know, they have their lifespans. And you can see that this painting by Tom Brown is very much, I can't know how to go back here. You could see very much that they were painting together. And that was a legacy of McCan. He made friendships in his paintings, in his painting career. He painted alongside the Onderdonks. He taught Dolly Nabinger how to paint, who became a very successful artist. And as he goes along, you can see that the brushland is starting to change. The mesquites are getting bigger, more frequent. You can see he's got more motion as he continues in his career. You can almost see these turkey going to roost. You can almost hear them with their little calls that they put out at sunset. And so you can see that the landscape is changing in many ways too, from the barrenness that it was before big cattle herds to once cattle started becoming more populous on the land, there's more brush. The brush is getting bigger. It's a benefit to the wildlife as well. So here is a painting by Julian Onderdonk of Mr. McCan. I'm pretty sure this is in the hill country on the Guadalupe. And he made a gift of it to Mr. McCan. So he enjoyed this fellowship with painters along the way. And in fact, about this time, in 1914, Mr. McCan established the first statewide Society of Texas Artists. And he started he convened a group there at the St. Anthony Hotel, including Eugenia Price, Tom Brown, the Onderdonks, and Leo Cotton, a number of artists who would go on to become very well known. And they decided that this society would be sort of a fellowship of comparing pricing, comparing methods of selling, juried shows, all of the above. And so their first show was they were invited to Austin by Elizabeth Ney to do a show there at her studio. And slowly thereafter, they were having shows in Dallas and Houston. And as oilmen started coming in as well and developing their fields, they wanted, and they were moving into the cities, they wanted a remnant of the rural society they had come from. And so he was getting all these commissions, but a lot of times if they didn't pay what he wanted, he'd turn them down. And so, unlike the underdogs, Mr. McCan was very judicious in what he would accept or not accept. And I think it was maybe a matter of economy, I'm not sure. But here we can see him in his studio. He's painting the Outwater Prairie chicken that's at the King Ranch. And that's Mr. McFadden in the foreground. And here his studio was in a place called the O'Connor Building in Victoria. So he's painting away. And he would occasionally have shows at his studio, but mostly he would prevail on the local shoe store or grocery or what have you, with the big storefronts. And that's what he did with the big Mastiff dog that hung in a place called the Hub, and it belongs to Mrs. Womack. So here and this didn't make it in the book because I didn't know enough about this photograph, but here he clearly had a sort of a jury going on in this building. I'm pretty sure this is in Victoria, and a bunch of painters sitting around. And painters would often come visit him from all over. He had a miniaturist come visit him because he wanted to learn how to make miniatures. But he liked to pick up sort of tips from other artists, and I don't think he really liked to work alone. He really was a very convivial sort of fellowship kind of guy, enjoyed his friendships. The other friendships he loved were those people in the volunteer fire department, and he became quite close to them. But this is clearly some kind of jury, or, they're all looking at these various paintings. He also loved fishing. And Dr. McKinney was speaking earlier about tarpon. McCann's brother lived at Port O'Connor and had his family there. And so he would go, Jim McCan would go visit his brother Henry, and they would tarpon fish. And you can see the size of the boats there on the right. The boats were smaller than the tarpon, so I don't really know how they did that. So my theory is that they hauled the tarpon in, beached them, and I know that there was a letter in the collections by a gentleman who was a doctor in Victoria who had gone off to World War I, and he said, "I sure wish we could have a tarpon barbecue on the beach at Port O'Connor." So he did like his fishing, and he did it whenever he could. He loved fishing so much that he made a float. Every year he'd do a pageant to benefit the fire department. And this is actually Mary Carroll's house right here, where the McCans lived. And this is Claude McCan dressed as a frog. And the float, he did all these floats in the town with paper mache, and then he'd write a play, and they would act in the play. And this float is called Sea Monster. And so the boys are getting ready to be in the parade. And here's another float with a bunch of girls on it. And all these children would then, descend from their floats and put on a play that he would do. And almost every year, he chose this woman, Mary Dolores Welder, to be Queen Guadalupe, or whatever the queen was. And it was a royalty thing. And she was quite the beauty of Victoria. And the band, the fireman's band, the volunteer fire department would play on the town square. And it was a big deal. And the volunteer fire department somehow made money doing this, raising funds. One of his very good friends in the fire department was a man named Fields, and this is his little boy, little Dickie Fields, and this belongs to Maggie Morrissey. And then Mary Carroll found the photograph of the little boy. And what dawned on me eventually after studying these things, especially his letters to Dolly Nabinger, was to take photos of the subject matter so that he would spend time with the subject, but then he had a photograph to refer to. So especially, he said, if you're painting, a lot of his students painted on the Guadalupe, and they would write to him that it was very difficult in July and August. It was so hot. So he advised them to take pictures of whatever it was they were photographing. So here's one of his classes on the Guadalupe, and not Dolly Nabinger is one of these women, and her name was Dolly Speidel. Actually, was her maiden name, and he was very impressed with her, and he sent her off to New York to study with a friend of his who was a printmaker. And so she studied there for a while, and then she wrote to him saying, I want to come back to San Antonio, and I want to study with Jose Arpa. He's only charging $1 per class. So she did it with his recommendation. And she went on to become really pretty well known. As you probably know, there was a competition in 1927 by Edgar Davis. It ran for about 3 years, where the painters would compete, and the purse was, quite large for the best painter, best Texas painter. And it began in 1927. But poor Mr. McCan had passed away by then from diabetes. So this is why his name remained kind of behind the scenes, although he did so much for Texas art. Here's another example of him using a photograph. It's a taxidermic golden eagle. And one of his most famous paintings in the day, and this is the study that belonged to Sue Cannon, was he called it the Golden Monarch of the Golden West. And he copyrighted it in Washington. It's one of the few that he actually copyrighted. And it hangs today in the St. Anthony Hotel lobby. And they were unable to loan it to this exhibition, but you're more than welcome to see it. It's probably 11 feet tall. It's really an enormous painting. But it was considered one of his masterpieces. And in fact, the way it ended up at the St. Anthony was that the man who bought the St. Anthony Hotel was really good friends with our mayor, John Tobin, in the day. And he purchased it for the St. Anthony, which he was renovating. And he also moved up to the hill country about that time. This painting belongs to Marvin and Jill Smith. And we think this is somewhere in where the summer camps are in the hill country. He had moved up to the hill country for his health. And so, interestingly, toward the end of his painting life, he started doing more and more with oaks, bluebonnets. He loved cypress trees. He loved how the cypress would turn. And here he was painting more elaborate scenes. I think he would go to one place and paint several different renditions at his time there. And he continued to try to school his students, even though he had moved up to the hill country. He also painted, and I'm crazy about these studies. As we neared the end of the book process and all the research, I was ready. We used a great book designer named Rich Hendel in Chapel Hill. And I said, well, I think, Rich, we're ready to go. And he's like, are you sure? And I said, yeah. About an hour later, I got a call from Claudia Knudsen and Maggie Morrissey saying, guess what? What? I was like, other shoe to drop. And they said, we found 26 more paintings. And they were in the garage of the farmhouse. And it was so great, they called them practice paintings, which I immediately understood. I have a family of artists myself. And these were studies. And they're all, you'll see them in a minute in the gallery. But here's his beloved tarpon. And then we have a pompano and a redfish. And, you know, these paintings of nautical paintings, in my knowledge, I mean, I've seen a lot of Texas art in my life, but to see coastal pictures, I think is really pretty rare and pretty wonderful. So he's painting his tarpon, and what's interesting is he liked them enough that he glazed them. But as you can see in this tarpon one, he left the edges unglazed, so they curled up. But when Claudia brought them to us, we took them in and we immediately put them in interleaving to try to see if the canvases would relax, because they were kind of curled up and pretty dirty. But it's amazing they made it through 100 years. So I call Rich Hendel and I'm like, guess what? And he's like, oh no. So he had to go back to the drawing board. And so we put another section in the book called Studies. Here's another study. It's very similar to the ones that are at the King Ranch. This is a cottontail. And this was a very European way of depicting, you know, I guess you would call it sort of a still life, because the life is gone. We also found his connection to San Antonio. So here's a charro near Mission San Jose, and today the the Charro Association still does their rodeos right there by Mission San Jose. So you can tell he's kind of probably living in the world we live in, but at a much earlier time. These studies, when Al Rendon photographed these, and he's such a marvelous photographer, I pulled these out and he's like, wow, you saved the best for last. So, and we found these studies of the King Ranch. This was of the Santa Gertrudis Creek with the commissary in the back. And this was before the new house was built in 1917 in that area. And that's another little study he did. But to our knowledge, he never painted the whole house in a big painting. By then, his health was starting to fail. He had tried to enlist in the Army for World War I as a camouflage painter, which those artists would be brought in and they would paint tanks or even compounds so that they couldn't be seen by overhead bombers. But because of his age, he was denied going. So instead, he helped build some airstrips near Victoria for drills. But he did get a passport he decided in 1917 he was going to go traveling through Europe. And he applied for a passport to go to about 6 different countries. His friend, who was a doctor in World War I, who decamped he was assigned with the doctor corps in World War I, was also then reassigned to do reparations. So he was sent back in 1918 to help Romania with securing the safety of children and of the Jewish population. So he writes to Mr. McCan, who is his fishing buddy, and said, you got to come over here. I've just met the Queen of Romania, and she wants you to paint her picture. And the Queen of Romania writes to Mr. McCan and says, I would like you to paint my picture, but I'm kind of old. I'm 45, and I don't think I'm a very attractive subject anymore. And I looked her up. She was one of the granddaughters of Queen Victoria, and she was beautiful, but she was war-torn and very haggard, sort of, not very, a little haggard looking. But all the pictures you saw of her were among orphans and among the children of Romania, trying to restore peace, restore the buildings, what have you. So Mr. McCan never made it, though, to Romania or Europe. His health started failing. He went to the Seton Hospital in Austin for treatments. Returned to live in Kerrville, but unfortunately suffered a seizure. They sent him to San Antonio and he passed away. But sadly, it was 2 years, like I said, before this Davis competition, which blew up Texas painting in a very big way right before the Depression started. So it's been a really great experience to get to know the McCan family and all of your relatives and the King Ranch participants and Dr. Smith and Mrs. Womack. It's been, and Morgan O'Connor and Carol Griffith and everybody who has these paintings, they remained in private hands because he never really, that we knew of, had an exhibition until we found one contract in that box of research materials. And it was a contract with the city of San Antonio initiated by Claude McCan to allow Mayor John Tobin and G.A.C. Half, whose family derived from Victoria, part of the Levy family. And they signed this document with Claude to borrow 14 paintings to hang at the municipal auditorium, which had been built. And then after a few months, these paintings would move to a new building being built in Breckenridge Park called the Witte Museum. And so what we found out is through newspaper accounts and the city council votes that Mr. McCan's 14 paintings showed here at the very first show in 1926 of the Witte Museum, which brought goosebumps to all of us when we found out. Now, I looked through all the annuals, the annual reports of the Witte, and they didn't document so well the art exhibits and any of the exhibits as well. They documented their lack of funding. So you read a lot about the lack of funding, but you don't read very much about Atwater or these early Texas painters. But we know they exhibited here for at least, it was about 4 or 5 months until they started moving on with other exhibitions. So this is a story that's come full circle, and I'm so glad to know all of you. It's been a wonderful green light experience, as they say, and so now we have a story and behind the man. So anyway, thank you, and I hope you enjoy the reception.